Isn't that a wonderful song there? We just wrapped up this portion of the service. So simple. God, you're so good. These children who are leaving, going to children's church right now, it's a song that they learned. I remember when I was their age, I was learning that song. Such simple lyrics, and yet so true. And that's what music should do for us. Worship music should allow us to express our thoughts to God. How He is so good, how He is so forgiving, also how He is righteous and true. But when we come together like this, we come before a holy God to worship Him, to speak to Him in prayers and in songs, and then to listen to Him from His Word. Now, last week we began a series that was entitled, Who Cares? And I told you last week there's a couple of ways that this question can be asked. One way is that you ask it with all sincerity. You're like, who cares? In a sense of, do you care? But the other way to ask this question is with no sincerity at all. Like, who cares? And last week we saw Jesus go to what we called a Sabbath meal. And we saw how Jesus really cared for one person and all the people there. But one in particular was the man with dropsy, that Jesus healed even when Jesus knew that these other men there who cared more about their religious rules didn't really care so much about that man with dropsy. So we have seen in this meal, there were some who said, who cares? Our rules are more important. And then there was Jesus who said, I care. And the question I want us to ask in this series, both today and next week as well, is the question, do I care? Do I really care the way Jesus cares? Or do I care about myself more than anything the way the religious leaders at that meal cared? That's the real question. Now, last week we saw how Jesus confronted these men with two questions of His own. But today we're going to see how Jesus continues to confront these men through, first of all, a parable that is directed toward those men who were at the table who had been invited by the host. But lest the host himself think that he was left out, then in conclusion, Jesus actually speaks some direct instructions to the host about inviting people to his next event. And as I said during our prayer time, on one level, the parable and these instructions sound like Jesus is talking about parties that take place here on earth. But what Jesus is actually doing is He's talking about these earthly events in a way that teaches us about the eternal event of resurrection and the glories of heaven or the torments of hell. And that's what I want us to see today, both on that surface level in our life right now, but also that eternal level. And the question is, how do we care about people and places? And these places are places of influence. How do we care about people and places in our lives? Now, we understand instinctively that in this sin-fallen world that there are a lot of people who only care about people and places in a way that advances themselves. For instance, when I was in high school and college, I remember when you had students who would throw a party, they would usually only invite the kids to the party that they thought that were socially acceptable, that would advance their social status. And they didn't invite people who did not contribute to where they wanted to go in that high school or college society. Now, what that meant was that Marty didn't get invited to many high school parties nor college parties, because I wasn't one of those guys who was, the cool kid. Just like right now, I'm not a cool man. I get it. My children keep me humble, believe me. But what Jesus is saying here is that is the way people throughout history have looked at themselves and their events. Is they, as worldly, selfish people, they only invite other worldly people that they think will help them in the world. And that pertains to who they invite into their life and into their events. Now, folks, this is a human condition that has been almost from the beginning of time. This is such a pervasive human theme that we see it not only in our lives, like whether you were invited to the parties or not, but we see the same theme all the time, even in Hollywood. You see the idea of the social outcast being mocked by the social in class, And then, of course, there's always this, payback kind of thing that would happen. One movie that my sons introduced me to, which I will say ranks in the top 5 dumbest movies I've ever seen in my life, is the movie Napoleon Dynamite. You seen that movie? You know it is dumb. But you see this theme in this movie, where you've got Napoleon and his buddy Pedro, his new friend Pedro. They are a couple of the nerdiest, most socially outcast members of this particular school. And yet they concoct this idea where they were going to have Pedro run for the class presidency or the student body presidency against the most popular girl in school. And then, of course, all the antics that take place during the movie, by the end of the movie, everything's turned upside down on its head, and Pedro actually wins. Now, real life, that doesn't happen very often. In real life, usually, you got the elites, and they exclude the outcast. Well, that's what Jesus was seeing. Not a flip-flop on this as Napoleon Dynamite has. But what Jesus sees are the elite men at this meal, and how they invited this guy with dropsy just to test Jesus to see if they were going to invite Jesus into their club, so to speak. And Jesus failed because he was more concerned about this man of insignificance, the man with dropsy, than he was about their club rules, so to speak. So these elite men, they were actually using this man with dropsy to their own advantage. And that's the way people who are all about themselves do. They will only invite people into their lives that they think gives them advantage. And in this series, I hope you're asking the question, am I like the men at the meal, or am I like Jesus? Am I like the men who say, who cares, just so I get what I want? Or am I like Jesus, who really did care about everybody? So now, after confronting the men with the 2 questions, now Jesus is going to confront these men with a parable. And the parable is directed toward the men sitting there, but he's also going to confront the host himself with some instructions. And I hope we learn from this confrontation how we ought to be examining our own lives to see if we really care. So the first point in today's message is that we need to be careful not to care more about ourselves when it comes to places. Places. And these are places of position that we're talking about more than anything. So let's pick up in verse 7 of Luke chapter 14. So Jesus told a parable to those who were invited when Jesus noted how those who had been invited chose the best places. So Jesus was saying to them, when you are invited by anyone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in the best place, lest one more honorable than you be invited by the host. And the host who invited you and that more honorable man come and say to you, says, give place to this man. And then you become ashamed to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down in the lowest place, so that when the host who invited you comes, that he may say to you, friend, go on up higher. Then you will have glory in the presence of those who sit at the table with you. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Now, the key verse in all this section is verse 11. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Now, Jesus, he's using this event, this Sabbath meal, an earthly gathering. But folks, these words are speaking about the heavenly gathering someday after resurrection and judgment. And what the point is the people who live exalted in this life in their own minds, man, someday they are going to be humbled. But the people who understand who they really are in God's eyes, and they come before God humbly, they are the ones that God will lift up and exalt one day at the resurrection. So now this is what Jesus is meaning, but he's using this meal and this parable to teach these men a lesson they need to learn. And I hope we learn the lesson as well today. Number 1, in verse 7, we see that Jesus is telling a parable. That's what Luke tells us. Jesus told a parable. And in verse 7, we are told by Luke why Jesus is telling this parable. Notice at the last part, because Jesus had noted how they, that's the men who were invited, how they chose the best places. Now, what's being described by Luke, I can just picture in my mind, is that Jesus got to this Sabbath meal early. And unlike these other men, Jesus sort of stood back in the corner, didn't take a seat at the table yet, or maybe took a low seat, But he stood back and like a wallflower, he was watching all the other guys as they came into the room. And when these men who were invited by the ruler of the Pharisees came in, what they did was they tried to take the best seats in the room. Now, in ancient Israel, the seating order at a meal was very important. It indicated the social pecking order of the day, which means if you were really important, you would sit close to the head of the table where the host would sit, and if you were less important, you would sit further on down the table toward the end. Now, notice what Jesus saw. When they came in, the men thought so highly of themselves, they all tried to get at the head of the table close to the host. And nobody took the lower seats down at the other end of the table. Why? The host didn't place them there. They placed themselves there because they thought they were so important that they deserved those high places. Now, Jesus was identifying with this, a sinful instinct in human beings. Our sinful instinct is we want to be close to big-time people. We want to be close to people of significance so that they might rub off on us. And we see it all the time, all around us. For instance, when fans or groupies go to a concert, where do they want to position themselves? Preferably up by the stage, really close. The closer they get to the band, the better. How about a political rally, especially like if it's a presidential candidate? Where do people want to be? As close as you can be, whether it's up close to the stage or even in these rallies lately, sitting behind the president so when the camera's on them, you can wave and identify with the president or presidential candidate. How about a sporting event? Where do people want to sit? As close to the floor of the field as they can, right in the center, as close to the athletes as possible. Why do we always want to be as close as possible to the people of significance? It's because there's something about our sinful nature. We think that if we can get close to people of significance, it might rub off on me. Now, I take that and understand why Baptists always want to sit in the back of the sanctuary all the time. I get it, okay? But the instinct is to sit close to people of significance. And that's what Jesus saw. He saw these men wanting to sit close to the host, who was the ruler of the Pharisees. But Jesus saw more than where they wanted to sit. He saw where they thought they deserved to sit. And that's the problem. So let me ask you, first of all, do you think that you deserve the best in life? I mean, that's the American way, isn't it? I deserve the best. My family deserves the best. Well, what I hope you learn from today's lesson, as soon as you think you deserve the best, you're on the slippery slope that can take you down to selfishness, arrogance, and pride. And that's what Jesus is trying to teach these men. Jesus is showing them, first of all, that selfish people seek the best places. Selfish people seek the best places. Notice in verse 8, Jesus said, do not sit down in the best place. And in verse 9, he said, and then you begin with shame to take the lowest place. Now, this is part of the parable. And in verse 8, we are told that this parable is about a wedding feast. Now, of course, in hindsight, we can look at this and we can tell this parable is not about a wedding feast. It's about this Sabbath meal. And the parable is not about the people in this hypothetical wedding feast. It's about these men that Jesus just watched. Luke gave us that insight. And I'm thinking, if these men are so dense, so self-absorbed that they couldn't understand that Jesus' parable was all about them, I'm not sure they got much hope. But that's who the parable was all about. But Jesus, disassociating, not being quite as offensive as he could have been, he says, okay, let me tell you a story about a wedding feast. And then he says, the guests that went to the wedding feast, they shouldn't have sat down in the best places. Why shouldn't they sit down in the best places? Jesus tells the story in such a way, he said, because there may be somebody who's more important than you in the host's eyes, and if you sit at the head of the table, you may get asked to move on down to the cheap seats because you may not be as important as what you think you are. Now that's Jesus' point, and that's a point that we all need to take into consideration about ourselves. That so often we think we deserve the best place, when in reality we don't. Now, like I said, in the Jewish culture, this was very important. The seating order in an event was very important. It's not as important to us today, so we may not feel exactly what they were feeling in this parable. You know, one of the closest things as I was thinking about seating order and the embarrassment of getting told go to the cheap seats was back when we were in our 20s. Becky and I, we decided we were going to go to a UK basketball game at Rupp Arena. Now, this is a massive arena, 25,000 seats. Now, I'm a cheapskate, so I bought the cheap tickets up in what's known as nosebleed section, where you got the hard bleachers with no backs on them. That's in upper arena. But Becky and I had never been to a UK ball game, so we didn't know the seating etiquette of a ball game like this. So we got there, and I noticed, look in that lower arena where they've got backs on their seats and everything, there's all kinds of open seats. Isn't this like church? You just claim whichever seat you first can find. So we decided we were going to go down to lower arena and see if we could grab us a couple of better seats. But when we were getting ready to enter into the lower arena, right there at the stairway, there was an usher. And the usher said, "May I see your tickets?" And I'm like, uh-oh. So I handed him my tickets, and he looked, and he said, "Oh, no, you can't come down into these seats. Your ticket's for the upper arena. You need to go back and up the steps to the upper arena." And of course, I turn around, and here's this line of people who are lower arena ticket holders, and I got to sort of drop my head and walk past them as I'm going up to where I was told that's my seat. Now, I understand there's an usher at the head of every set of steps dropping down into the lower arena, because there's a lot of people like me who try to get those lower arena seats who don't belong there. I get that. I wasn't the first, but that was my time. And I was a little embarrassed when I had to walk past those other people who they belonged in the lower arena, and me and Becky did not. Now, that's as close as I could feel what Jesus was trying to communicate to these guys, but it's even more intense with them, because this was part of their society, and it wasn't that they just had the wrong ticket. They were not of the high enough social standing to get to that place on the table. That's what he's describing. But the point is that Jesus is trying to tell these guys who think that they are so important that when they come into a Sabbath meal, they quickly grab the best seats. Jesus' point is, don't think so highly of yourself. Because if you think so highly of yourself today when it comes to earthly things, you're going to think way too highly of yourself about eternal things as well. God, I deserve this. You know, Jesus even told the story, there's going to be people that go up to Jesus on the day of judgment, and they're going to say, "Look at all these things I did for you, Jesus." And what's Jesus going to tell them? "Depart from me, you workers of iniquity, for I never knew you." You think your good stuff makes you worthy. And he's saying, no, you're going to the cheap seats, the lowest of places. And where is the lowest of the low places in judgment? Hell. Jesus is trying to teach them an eternal truth through this parable about an earthly gathering. Selfish people today, we seek the best places. But Jesus is trying to teach them that humble people will seek low places. Look in verse 10. Jesus in this parable says, "Go and sit down in the lowest place, so that when he," talking about the host who invited you, "comes, he may say to you, 'Friend, go up higher.'" Now, what Jesus is telling these guys in this parable is, look, don't think too highly of yourself. Think lowly of yourself. Think humbly about who you are. And when you think humbly, then you're in a position that the one who is over you, he will lift you up. Not because you believe that you deserve being lifted up, but because he sees your humble attitude, and it's with that he will raise you up. Jesus was not teaching these men social etiquette for his day. Jesus' goal was not to help these men not to be embarrassed at the next gathering. Jesus' goal was to teach these men the eternal truth about who they are. And what the Bible teaches us is that each and every one of us, we have no worth that makes us deserve heaven. There's nothing about us in our sin that makes us worthy of heaven. And it is only when you understand that about yourself that you will be in a position where God is ready now as the one over you to raise you up, like the host of heaven. You see, when you think that you're a good person, "Oh, I'm a good person," you're on the slippery slope of arrogance and pride like the men at the meal. It's only when you realize how bad you really are that you will cry out to God, I can't do anything to deserve to be in your glorious presence. And that's when you will open yourself up to the gospel, when the Bible says, God knows that about you, but he still loves you and sent his son to die for you. You can't earn your way to the best place. But if you'll put your faith in my son, I will raise you up to the best place. Folks, that's what Jesus was trying to teach these guys. It's not about a party invitation. It's about the eternal invitation. And we need to be careful not to care more about ourselves when it comes to these places. We need to understand who we are. We deserve the lowest of the low places, but God wants to lift us up to the best place by faith in his son. Now, that was the parable related to the guys who were invited, but I told you, Jesus didn't want to leave the host out. So Jesus turns his attention to the host in verses 12 through 14, and from this encounter, we need to learn that we should be careful not to care more about ourselves when it comes to people. Because the way that you think about people will reveal the way you think about yourself. And I think that's what Jesus was teaching these guys. So let me pick up in verse 12. So then Jesus also said to him who invited, that's the host, to him who invited Jesus. This is what Jesus said. When you give a dinner or a supper, do not ask your friends, your brothers, your relatives, nor rich neighbors, lest they also invite you back and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. For you shall be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Now, it's that last phrase that gives us the indication Jesus is talking about more than an earthly party. He says, you will be blessed. You will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Jesus is talking about eternal matters, not earthly matters. But notice how Jesus is talking to the host here. He shifts his attention to the ruler of the Pharisees who invited everybody there, including Jesus. And Jesus, I can just picture in my mind, as he's sitting there at the table with everybody else, he looks straight into the eyes of the host. And he says these words. He says basically, don't invite people the way you invited people to this meal. Invite people that you did not invite to this meal. And I can just imagine in my mind, Jesus was staring right into the host's eyes, knowing that the host is not going to like this, because Jesus did not suck up to anybody to advance himself socially. Jesus just spoke the truth, because Jesus knew the truth is what sets us free, not somebody just telling you what you want to hear. So what Jesus was trying to tell this host, and what we ought to hear from him, is that selfish people seek the best people in their lives. Selfish people seek the best people. Notice in verse 12 again. Do not ask your friends, your brothers, your relatives, nor your rich neighbors. Now, in essence, what Jesus is doing is identifying four types of people that this host obviously invited to his gatherings. Don't just invite your friends. Now, these are the people you like hanging out with. They're sort of like you, and you all get along. Don't just invite your brothers. These are the ones that your mama makes you feel guilty if you don't invite them. So just to keep mama quiet, you're going to go ahead and invite your siblings to the get-together. Don't just invite your relatives. These are the people that you feel obligated to invite, and you know that you ought to, and you go ahead and invite them, knowing it'll make your life easier. But the fourth one's the one that really triggers what we ought to be thinking about. Don't invite just your rich neighbors. Now notice the qualifier, your rich neighbors. He didn't say don't just invite your neighbors. He said your rich neighbors. Don't invite the poor neighbors. Don't invite the sick neighbors. Don't invite the socially unacceptable neighbors. That's not what Jesus said. Jesus said don't invite just your rich neighbors. And with this last type of person, Jesus is identifying what he saw in the host there that day. He saw a man who invited people that he liked. He invited people that he felt obligated he had to invite. And more importantly, he invited people that he thought would advance him socially. Jesus saw in this ruler of the Pharisees, he saw a man who thinks like a lot of 21st century people think. Even Christians, if we're not careful. What we do is we invite people into our lives that we like, or we feel obligated, or we think can help us out. Who was invited to your Thanksgiving meal? Did you invite crazy Uncle Harry? The one that is always saying things that makes you feel so uncomfortable and you're like, I just don't want him here. Who are you going to invite to your Christmas gathering? Are you going to refuse to invite that person that always brings a weird kind of gift that you're like, what are you thinking? Because that person just is weird. You're not going to invite that person, right? Who are you going to invite to your New Year's party? Your New Year's Eve party, are you going to invite all the people that like to do the things you like to do, but you're not going to invite that person who lives their faith out in such a way that you know they're going to be uncomfortable because of the activities you do at this party or the things that you're serving at this party. I don't want to invite that person because that person makes me uncomfortable around all of my worldly friends. Do you exclude people from your life simply because they make you uncomfortable? Socially uncomfortable? Spiritually uncomfortable? Or are you like Jesus? Every chance you get, you just invite anybody and everybody because all people need to know Jesus. Who do you invite? That's what Jesus is asking this host. And he's seeing selfishness in him, and basically he's pointing out, you're just inviting friends, family, and people who can advance you socially. But what Jesus is trying to teach him is that truly humble people seek the low people. Truly humble people, like Jesus, who humbled himself in the form of a man to die. Truly humble people will seek out even low people based on societal standards. Notice in verse 13, Jesus said, invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind. These are all of the people that the man sitting at the head of the table in this Sabbath meal would not invite into his house. But Jesus said, these are the very kinds of people you ought to be inviting. Now, I don't think Jesus' point was to say you shouldn't be inviting these other people, because this is an eternal lesson he's teaching. He's saying you shouldn't be so arrogant about yourself that you only invite people into your lives who make you comfortable or who can advance you. You need to invite all kinds of people into your life. People who benefit you, that's okay, as long as you understand that's really arrogant and you just want to help them rather than them help you. But people who need your help desperately, whether physically or eternally, you need to be like Jesus and invite everybody into your life. And that was Jesus' point. But so often we don't even do that today. We're more like the men at the table than like Jesus. You see, the men at the table, when it came to the poor, the maimed, the lame, and the blind, in public, they would give a little display, a nod, or just, acknowledge them a little bit. We read this in the gospel quite often. Like when it talks about the temple courtyard, you see the sick and the poor and the needy. They're sitting around the temple courtyard, and they got their cups, and they're begging for alms. Alms is a word, A-L-M-S. This is a term in Jewish culture that means when the haves share a little with the have-nots. And that's a good thing, when the haves share with the have-nots. But the problem is, in the Jewish culture, we can understand from the Gospels, there were a lot of the people who were the haves who would, in public, share a little bit with the have-nots. Why? So everybody could see them drop a few coins in their cup. Well, the thing is that just like based upon who they would invite into their home for their party, the way they even treat the poor out in public was all about advancing them. Look at me. Look at how good I am. Well, Jesus was saying, look, don't just throw them a few cents. Invite them to your parties. In other words, invite them into your life activities where you can really get to know them. Because Jesus invited all kinds of people into his life because he wanted them all to get to know him because he understood they all need to know him in order to be saved. He went to the rich people's houses and had these Sabbath meals, these arrogant and prideful men, because they need to know Jesus. He spent time with them, quality time. And he also spent quality time with poor people, needy people, people who are socially unacceptable because they just as much need to know him as the elites. And Jesus is telling this elite, if you really want to be right before God in heaven at the resurrection, then your attitude will be so humble that you will be inviting all kinds of people into your lives. Now, as Christians today, if we're not careful, we will fall into the same trap where we only invite people into our lives that we feel comfortable with them. And even churches take on personalities to the point where often they, birds of a feather flock together. The church is comprised of pretty much just people like each other, and they find it very difficult to invite people who don't really fit in to the social standing. Church like ours is typically a middle-class kind of church, and if we're not careful, we'll only want middle-classers with us. And that's not the Jesus way. You see, one of the things as pastor I want to do is create environments where we can invite all kinds of people into it. And as I said last week, our Wednesday night harvest meals is part of that. It is designed in order for us to be inviting people who maybe have needs, financial needs, and they need somewhere where they can get a little financial relief. And we will give them a meal. And in fact, some of our ladies are preparing to have coats and quilts and things for the winter season. And there's other things that go on during the Wednesday night things. We will help people who have needs. It's not just for people who have needs, it's for all people. But it is targeted in that direction. And if we're not careful and we're like these religious leaders that Jesus was confronting, we will go out in the community and say, our church, we are helping people with needs. But yet we will not sit beside one of those people on a Wednesday night and spend any time with them and talk to them. We'll just go out and get the social benefits of saying, I belong to a church that's helping needy people, but we will not invite those needy people into our lives by giving them time. You see, there's a difference between using people the way that the rich did in Jesus' day and caring for people the way Jesus cared for them. Now, on your bulletins, on the back of your bulletins this week, I've given you a description of 3 Connect Ministries that we want to implement more fully during the year 2022. And the purpose of these Connect Ministries is to help all kinds of people to connect with our church. Number 1 is the Connect Luncheon. The Connect Luncheon is designed that anybody who is a guest that's been coming a long time, first time or whatever, on certain Sundays of the year after our worship services, we will have a luncheon over in the fellowship hall. And the goal is that anybody, whether they're Wednesday night attenders, Sunday morning attenders, whoever, or just somebody we invite off the street, you got my permission when you know it's a Connect Sunday, invite anybody. And we will, as a church, we will serve them a meal and we will share with them avenues by which these individuals can connect with our church. All right, we're already sort of doing that. We just sort of changed the name a little bit. But the next one I want you to notice is at the end of what I wrote. It's Connect Fellowships. What we want to do in the year 2022 is every month have a church-wide fellowship. Our first one's going to be on December the 12th at 6 p.m. We're actually going to have a business meeting at 5, and then we're going to go into the fellowship at 6, all right? Now, this fellowship is going to be a gingerbread house making contest. The church will supply all of the materials needed to build a gingerbread house. You come in, and maybe it's your family, or maybe you say, hey, come here, join my group. And you'll set up a table. You'll go to the table with the supplies. You'll get what you need. You will build your gingerbread house, and somebody's going to judge among all the gingerbread houses which one they think the best is. You bring some snacks and things like that. We'll just have a good time together. Here's the thing. This is for you to attend so that we can get to know each other better as a congregation. But this is also for you to invite someone out there to attend. And if you know somebody that makes you uncomfortable and you just haven't figured out, how can I, show Christ to them, but in a way that I think is safe, well, invite them to one of these Connect Fellowships, all right? Now, in the middle, I've described what we call Connect Families. This is something we want our church families to be a part of. What it is if you sign up your family, then we want to link your family with at least two other families. And we would like over the next 4 months for you all to gather outside of the church facilities at least 3 times. You can do it more if you want to, but at least 3 times. And what we want is for you to get to know other families that you don't currently know very well. So if I see names of, okay, this family, and I know this family, they've known each other forever, then guess what? You're not going to be linked with that family. I'm going to link you with people you don't know well as much as I possibly can. You're like, that makes me uncomfortable. Exactly. But that's what will help our church grow. But if you're on a Wednesday night and you're sitting beside somebody and you're just building a relationship with someone who doesn't come on Sunday morning, and you say, hey, my family is going to be a part of a Connect family ministry over the next 4 months, would you be a part of our family as we get to know these families? Hey, I'm good with that. Because I want us just to get to know each other and know people who need to know the Lord. And that's what these Connect ministries are all about. Because Jesus told us, invite not just people with whom we feel comfortable. Invite the poor, the lame, the maimed, the blind. And here's the thing. You don't even need a church ministry structure. You can do this on your own. You know, I can remember times when Becky and I have invited people into our family's life at times that were a little awkward, but it was very meaningful. I remember since we've been here, there was one time we invited a homeless guy to our El Patron's Father's Day meal that we had. So that was my Father's Day meal over at El Patron's, and here's a homeless guy right beside of us. It was a little awkward, but it was good. And our boys got to see and experience inviting other people that aren't like us into a family meal. Now, I'm not saying you have to invite them into your home, because I told you last week, be careful about the safety of your family. That's legit. But there's plenty of other ways we can do it. Another time we invited a guy who we knew was a drug dealer that wasn't real happy with us. We invited him to join us for lunch after church over at the Chinese restaurant. That was interesting, especially after it was over. I looked over at Big E's, and he's got this big old Bowie knife about this long he pulled out of his pocket. And I'm like, but it's still, that's what Jesus is talking about. And am I great at it? No. But I want to get better. Are you even interested in inviting people into your lives that don't benefit you, but who need you? That's where we start seeing spiritual maturity and growth. And that's what Jesus was trying to teach these men back then. And Jesus' words were so perfect, they apply to us right now in the 21st century.